The young millionaire couldn't believe his eyes when he saw the homeless little girl digging through trash on Christmas Eve. What happened next made him cry like never before. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The December wind cut through downtown Chicago like a blade, and Richard Sterling barely felt it through his $1,000 cashmere coat. At 38, he'd built an empire from nothing, transforming himself from a scrappy kid from the South Side into one of the city's most ruthless real estate moguls. His Bentley purred at the curb outside Morton's Steakhouse, where he'd just closed another deal that would displace 50 families by New Year's. Christmas Eve meant nothing to him anymore. It was just another Tuesday, another opportunity to make money while others celebrated their pathetic sentimentality. But as he walked toward his car, something made him stop. In the narrow alley between two towering buildings, barely visible under the flickering streetlight, a small figure hunched over a dumpster. Richard squinted through the falling snow. It was a child, a little girl with matted blonde hair, her tiny hands desperately digging through garbage bags, searching for something edible. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her clothes were nothing but rags. A torn pink dress that might have been pretty once, now stained and hanging loose on her skeletal frame. No coat. No shoes. Her bare feet were blue with cold against the frozen concrete. For the first time in 20 years, Richard Sterling felt something crack inside his chest. The girl found a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in paper and clutched it to her chest like treasure. When she looked up, her eyes met his through the swirling snow. Bright blue eyes that held no anger, no accusation, just pure exhaustion and the hollow look of someone who had lost everything. Those eyes. There was something about those eyes that made his breath catch in his throat. "Hey!" he called out, his voice rougher than intended. The girl startled like a frightened animal, clutching the sandwich tighter. She took a step backward, deeper into the shadows of the alley. "Wait," Richard said, raising his hands. "I'm not going to hurt you." Oh, but she was already running, her bare feet slapping against the wet pavement as she disappeared into the maze of Chicago's back streets, leaving Richard standing alone in the snow. He stood there for a long time, staring at the empty alley, trying to understand why his hands were shaking and why there were tears freezing on his cheeks. What he didn't know was that this 7-year-old girl named Lucy had been living on these streets for 3 months, ever since the car accident that took her parents. And what he couldn't possibly imagine was that she was about to teach him the most important lesson of his life. A lesson that would either save his soul or destroy everything he'd built. "This is ridiculous," he growled, loosening his silk tie with trembling fingers. "She's just another street rat. Chicago's full of them." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a desperate lie. There had been something about that little girl that cut straight through his defenses, the way she'd clutched that moldy bread like it was precious treasure. The complete resignation in her eyes, as if she'd already accepted that this frozen alley would be her grave. He tried drowning the memory in 3 glasses of his finest scotch, the kind that cost $500 a bottle, tried a scalding shower that left his skin red and raw, even attempted to review tomorrow's contracts, deals that would displace dozens more families in the name of progress and profit. Nothing worked. That child's face haunted him like a ghost. At 3 a.m, Richard Sterling made a decision that would have shocked everyone who knew him. He grabbed his coat and headed back to the streets, driven by a compulsion he couldn't name or understand. The wind had picked up since earlier, turning the falling snow into tiny ice bullets that stung his face. The alley where he'd first seen her was empty now, but he could make out small footprints in the snow leading deeper into the maze of back streets behind Michigan Avenue. He followed them like a man possessed, his expensive shoes slipping on the ice with each step. His breath formed clouds in the freezing air, and within minutes his fingers were numb despite his leather gloves. How was a 7-year-old child surviving in this? 20 minutes later, threading through the urban wasteland of Chicago's forgotten corners, he found her. She was huddled behind a rusted dumpster outside an abandoned restaurant, trying to create a pathetic shelter from the wind using soggy cardboard boxes and newspaper. Her tiny body was curled into a tight ball, shaking so violently from the cold that Richard could hear her teeth chattering from 10 feet away. "Jesus Christ," Richard whispered, his heart clenching with an emotion so foreign he barely recognized it. At this rate, she'd be dead before sunrise, another frozen casualty of a city that had forgotten how to care. He approached slowly this time, making sure his footsteps were loud enough to announce his presence without startling her. "Hey there, sweetheart," he called softly, his voice gentler than it had been in decades. Her head snapped up like a frightened animal, those same devastating blue eyes wide with terror. She scrambled backward instinctively, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped between Richard and the brick wall, cornered like the desperate creature she'd become. "Please don't run," Richard said, crouching down to her level so he wouldn't seem so imposing. "I want to help you. I promise I'm not going to hurt you." The little girl stared at him warily, her whole body trembling from more than just the cold. Up close, he could see the full extent of her condition. The hollowness in her cheeks from malnutrition, the dark circles under her eyes from exhaustion, the way her lips had turned blue from hypothermia. "Are you gonna call the police?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. The question hit Richard like a physical blow. This child was so broken by the system that she feared rescue itself. "No, honey, I promise. What's your name?" She hesitated for what felt like an eternity, studying his face as if trying to decide whether he was another threat or maybe, just maybe, something else. "Lucy," she finally said. "That's a beautiful name," Richard replied, and he meant it. "Like Lucy in the sky with diamonds. I'm Richard." He slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. "Lucy, when's the last time you had a real meal? Something hot and filling?" Her eyes fixed on the money with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't eaten in days, but she didn't move to take it. Instead, she lifted her chin with a dignity that shamed him. "I don't do bad things for money, mister. My mama taught me better than that." The innocence and morality in those words hit Richard like a sledgehammer to the chest. This child, literally dying of starvation and exposure, still held on to the principles her mother had instilled in her, while he, with all his wealth and privilege, had abandoned every decent value he'd ever learned. "Your mama sounds like she was a very good woman," Richard said gently, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't felt in years. "Where is she now, Lucy?" The little girl's face crumpled like paper, and she began to cry with the broken sobs of someone who had been alone too long. "She's with Jesus now," she whispered through her tears. Her and Daddy both. Richard felt something twist and break inside his chest as he watched this destroyed child weep for her lost parents. The sound of her grief echoed off the brick walls of the alley, mixing with the wind to create the loneliest symphony he'd ever heard. Without thinking, operating on an instinct he didn't know he possessed, he shrugged off his $1,000 cashmere coat and wrapped it around her tiny shoulders. The coat was so enormous on her skeletal frame that it looked like a blanket swallowing her completely. But it was warm from his body heat, and he saw her stop shivering for the first time since he'd found her. "Tell me what happened, sweetheart," he said softly, settling his expensive suit pants onto the frozen, filthy ground beside her. "Tell me about your mama and daddy." Lucy wiped her runny nose with the back of her dirt-crusted hand, leaving a dark streak across her pale cheek. When she looked up at him, her blue eyes were swimming with tears that seemed too heavy for such a small face to carry. "We were driving home from my dance recital," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind, whistling through the alley. "It was at the community center on Ashland. I had been practicing for months and months. Mama made me this beautiful white dress with sparkles on it, and she curled my hair real pretty." Her voice grew stronger as she remembered, a ghost of a smile flickering across her lips. "Mama said I looked like a real princess up on that stage. Daddy was in the front row taking pictures with his old camera. He was so proud of me, he was crying happy tears." The smile faded as quickly as it had come, replaced by a darkness that no 7-year-old should ever have to carry. Then we were driving home, and Daddy was singing this silly song he always sang when he was happy. Mama was laughing and telling him he couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. I was still wearing my princess dress in the back seat, feeling like the luckiest little girl in the whole world. Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. Then there was this big truck. The man driving it was drinking alcohol. Daddy saw him coming and tried to turn our car, but it was too late. The truck hit us so hard that our car flipped over 3 times. Richard's hands clenched into fists as he imagined the scene, this innocent family destroyed by some selfish drunk who couldn't be bothered to call a cab. "What happened after the crash?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "I was in the hospital for 2 whole weeks, Lucy said, pulling his coat tighter around herself. "The nurses were real nice to me. They said I was lucky to be alive, that my mama and daddy protected me, even when they were dying. But nobody came to get me when I got better. The police said I didn't have any grandparents or aunts or uncles. No family left anywhere." The words hit Richard like individual bullets. This child had lost everything, parents, home, family, future, in one terrible moment that wasn't even her fault. "They put me in a place with other kids who didn't have families," Lucy continued, her voice growing smaller. "But it was scary there. The big boys were mean to the little kids, and the grown-ups didn't care what happened when they weren't looking. One boy named Marcus, he was 13, and he said he was going to make me his girlfriend whether I wanted to or not." Richard's vision went red with rage. "Did he hurt you?" "He tried. But I remembered what Daddy taught me about fighting back." Lucy's jaw set with fierce determination. "So I bit his hand real hard and ran away. That was 3 months ago, right when it started getting cold. 3 months. This 7-year-old angel had been surviving alone on Chicago's brutal streets for 3 months. Through autumn's freezing rains and winter's killing cold, sleeping in doorways and eating garbage, all because the system designed to protect her had failed completely. Richard had known hardship in his own childhood after his mother died, but nothing like this. Nothing that could break a human spirit so thoroughly while somehow leaving its core intact. "Lucy, I want to take you somewhere warm," Richard said, standing up slowly and extending his hand to her. "Get you some real food, some clean clothes, maybe a hot bath. Would you let me do that for you?" The little girl looked up at him with those devastating blue eyes, searching his face for any hint of deception or hidden agenda. "Why do you want to help me, mister?" she asked. "Most people just walk by like they don't see me at all, like I'm already dead." It was a fair question, and Richard found himself struggling to answer honestly. Why did he care about this particular child when he'd walked past hundreds of homeless people without a second thought? What made Lucy Morrison different from all the other casualties of urban indifference? "Because," he said finally, surprised by the truth in his own words, "you remind me of someone I used to know a long time ago." Lucy tilted her head curiously, studying him with the piercing insight that only children possess. "Who do I remind you of?" Richard smiled sadly, thinking of a scared little boy who had once believed the world was good and fair and kind. A little boy who was lost once too, a long time ago. As they walked toward his Bentley parked on the street, Lucy's small hand trustingly placed in his, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this story. Something about the way she'd mentioned that dance recital, The pride in her father's voice, the family's obvious love for each other despite their modest circumstances. What were the astronomical odds that he, of all people, would find this particular child on this particular night? And why did her father's name, David Morrison, sound so hauntingly familiar? The Grand Chicago Hotel's presidential suite had hosted presidents, movie stars, and foreign dignitaries, but it had never welcomed a guest quite like Lucy Morrison. Richard watched as she stood in the marble foyer, her dirty bare feet stark against the pristine white Italian tile, completely overwhelmed by the opulence surrounding her on all sides. "This is where you live?" she whispered, her voice echoing off the 20-foot vaulted ceilings adorned with hand-painted frescoes. "Sometimes," Richard replied, suddenly seeing his lavish lifestyle through her innocent eyes, the crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's cars, the original Monet hanging casually on the wall, the furniture handcrafted by European artisans. It all seemed obscenely excessive now. He led her through the sprawling living area toward the guest bathroom, past walls lined with priceless art that he'd bought not for love, but for investment potential. "Why don't you get cleaned up while I order us some food?" he said, starting to run a hot bath in the marble tub. "Do you like pizza?" Lucy's dirt-streaked face lit up with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, transforming her features completely. For a moment, he could see the happy little girl she'd been before tragedy struck. "I love pizza," she exclaimed. "Daddy used to take me to Tony's every Friday night after he got paid. He'd let me put extra cheese on mine, and we'd share a root beer float." The simple memory of family tradition hit Richard harder than he'd expected. When was the last time he'd shared a meal with someone just for the joy of their company? When had he last cared about making someone else happy? While Lucy soaked in the enormous tub, the first hot bath she'd had in months, Richard called room service and ordered enough food to feed a small army. Then he searched through his wardrobe for something she could wear. The best he could find was one of his silk dress shirts, which would be comically oversized on her, but at least it was clean and soft. When she emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later, Richard barely recognized the child he'd found in that alley. Under all that dirt and desperation was a genuinely beautiful little girl with golden blonde hair that fell in soft curls around her shoulders. Her skin was pale but healthy looking now, and those remarkable blue eyes seemed to glow with renewed life. "You look like a real princess," Richard said, and meant every word. Lucy blushed and looked down at the oversized shirt that hung to her knees like a dress. "Mama used to say that too, especially when she'd brush my hair at night. She said I was her little angel." And they sat together on the plush velvet sofa, sharing a large pepperoni pizza from Chicago's most expensive restaurant. And Richard found himself genuinely laughing for the first time in years as Lucy regaled him with stories about her parents. Her father had been a mechanic who loved to sing country songs off-key while working under car hoods. Her mother had worked at a little flower shop downtown and always came home smelling like roses and baby's breath. "They sound like they were wonderful people," Richard said, watching her eat with the focused intensity of someone who'd been hungry too long. "They were perfect," Lucy replied seriously. "Daddy always said that being rich wasn't about money, it was about having people to love who love you back. He said we were the richest family in Chicago because we had each other." The wisdom in those simple words made Richard's chest tighten with something he hadn't felt since childhood, the ache of genuine loneliness. "Mr. Richard," Lucy said suddenly, setting down her pizza slice and studying his face with those perceptive eyes. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course, sweetheart." "How come you don't have a family? I mean, you got all this beautiful stuff and this fancy place, but there's no pictures of people anywhere, no toys or kid things. It's like nobody really lives here." The observation hit Richard like a physical blow because it was absolutely accurate. This penthouse suite was a showplace, not a home. a monument to wealth without warmth, success without soul. "I've been very busy building my business," he said lamely, using the same excuse he'd given himself for 20 years. Lucy continued studying his face with the unsettling insight that only children possess. "But that's not really why, is it? You're scared, aren't you?" Before Richard could answer that devastating question, his phone rang with the sharp, insistent tone he'd programmed for emergencies. The caller ID made his blood turn to ice. Margaret Thornfield, Director of Chicago Child Services. Someone had spotted them. Someone had reported a missing child, matching Lucy's description, being seen with a wealthy businessman in the dead of night. The authorities were already on their way up in the elevator. "Lucy," Richard said quietly, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, "I need you to stay calm, but some people are coming here who might want to take you away from me." The little girl's eyes widened with terror, and she grabbed his arm with both hands. "Please don't let them take me back to that place," she whispered. "Please, Mr. Richard, the big boys there, they hurt me." Richard looked down at this brave, broken child who had somehow managed to trust him despite everything she'd endured, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "I won't let anyone hurt you," he promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "No matter what happens, I'm going to protect you." The knock on the door came exactly 7 minutes later, sharp, authoritative raps that sounded like judgment itself. Margaret Thornfield was a formidable woman in her 50s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and the tired, cynical eyes of someone who'd spent decades navigating the bureaucratic nightmare of child welfare. She was flanked by 2 Chicago police officers whose hands rested casually on their service weapons, and a nervous-looking social worker Richard didn't recognize. The moment they entered the opulent suite, their eyes took in everything. The expensive artwork, the designer furniture, the child wearing nothing but an oversized men's shirt. Richard could practically see them forming judgments and drawing conclusions. "Mr. Sterling," Margaret said curtly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We understand you have Lucy Morrison with you." Lucy pressed herself against Richard's side like a terrified animal seeking shelter, her small hand clutching his shirt so tightly her knuckles were white. "Please don't make me go back to that place," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but carrying the weight of genuine terror. "The boys there hurt me real bad." Margaret's stern expression softened slightly at the fear in Lucy's voice, but her professional resolve remained intact. "Lucy, sweetheart, we've found you a new placement. A nice foster family in Naperville with 2 other little girls your age. They have a big backyard and a swing set, and they're excited to meet you." "No!" Lucy screamed, the sound echoing through the expensive suite like a siren of pure anguish. "I won't go. You can't make me. They always say the families are nice, but they're not." She bolted toward the bedroom, but one of the officers smoothly moved to block her path. The sight of this tiny, traumatized girl being cornered by uniformed men made Richard's vision turn red with protective rage. "Get away from her," he snarled, stepping between Lucy and the officer with the intensity of a man protecting his own child. "Mr. Sterling," Margaret warned, her voice taking on a dangerous edge, "interfering with Child Protective Services is a felony. I suggest you step aside immediately." "She's been abused in your system," Richard shot back, his carefully controlled businessman persona cracking to reveal the fury beneath. "Look at her. She's terrified of you people, and you want me to just hand her over?" Margaret's eyes narrowed as she studied Richard's defensive posture and the way Lucy clung to him. "And what exactly are your intentions here, Mr. Sterling? A 38-year-old bachelor who suddenly develops a savior complex and takes in a homeless child in the middle of the night? Forgive me if that raises some serious red flags." The implication hit Richard like a slap across the face. "How dare you?" he breathed, his voice deadly quiet. "I found her dying in an alley, and I'm trying to save her life." "The road to hell is paved with good intentions," Margaret replied coldly, "and wealthy men with questionable motives toward vulnerable children." She nodded to the social worker. "Take her." Dum. But as the adults approached Lucy with their official paperwork and practiced efficiency, something extraordinary happened. The little girl, who had been so defeated and broken when Richard found her, suddenly straightened up like a soldier preparing for battle. Her chin lifted with fierce determination, and her blue eyes blazed with an inner fire that reminded Richard of someone he couldn't quite place. "My name is Lucy Elizabeth Morrison," she announced in a clear, strong voice that carried to every corner of the room. "My daddy was David Morrison, and he owned Morrison Auto Repair on Clark Street. My mama was Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, and she worked at Petals and Bloom's flower shop on Michigan Avenue." The room fell silent as this 7-year-old girl commanded the attention of every adult present. They died on September 15th at 8:47 at night when a drunk driver named Thomas Walsh hit our car at the intersection of Lincoln and Fullerton, Lucy continued, reciting the facts with the precision of someone who had memorized every detail of her tragedy. The police report number was 2024-091547, and Officer Jennifer Martinez was the first responder. Margaret pulled out her tablet and began typing rapidly, cross-referencing Lucy's information. "My daddy always told me that bad people count on good people doing nothing," Lucy said, staring directly at Margaret with an intensity that made the seasoned social worker take a step back. "He said that when you see something wrong, you have to speak up, even if you're scared, especially if you're scared." She turned to look at each adult in turn, her voice never wavering despite the tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "Are you going to be good people who do something to help me? Or are you going to be the kind of people my daddy warned me about?" Richard stared at this incredibly brave little girl in absolute amazement. Where had this strength come from, this eloquence and courage in the face of overwhelming adult authority? And why did her father's name, David Morrison, Morrison Auto Repair, sound so achingly familiar? Margaret looked up from her tablet, her face pale as parchment. David Morrison, Morrison Auto Repair on Clark Street. She looked at Richard with an expression that was equal parts shock and something else he couldn't identify. "Mr. Sterling, I think we need to have a very serious conversation, right now." Margaret Thornfield dismissed the police officers and social worker with a curt nod and a whispered instruction that Richard couldn't quite catch. The tension in the opulent hotel suite was so thick it felt like breathing through molasses as the other officials filed out, leaving only Margaret, Richard and Lucy in the suddenly too quiet space. "Lucy, sweetheart," Margaret said gently, her entire demeanor transformed from bureaucratic authority to something approaching compassion. "Could you watch some television in the bedroom for a few minutes while I have an important talk with Mr. Sterling? I promise we're not going to make any decisions about you without letting you know first." Lucy looked up at Richard with those penetrating blue eyes, searching his face for reassurance. The trust she placed in him with that single look made his heart clench with an emotion so foreign he barely recognized it. "It's okay," Richard said softly, stroking her still damp hair. "I'll be right here. I'm not going anywhere." Lucy nodded solemnly and padded into the bedroom in her bare feet, but Richard noticed she left the door cracked open just wide enough to hear their conversation. Smart girl. After what she'd been through, trusting adults completely would be foolish. Margaret waited until the sound of cartoon characters drifted from the bedroom before turning to face Richard. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and what might have been divine irony that made Richard's stomach clench with dread. "David Morrison," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of buried secrets. "Morrison auto repair on Clark Street. What about him? Richard asked, though warning bells were ringing in his head like fire alarms. That name, combined with Margaret's expression, meant something terrible was about to be revealed. Margaret pulled out her tablet and scrolled through several screens of official-looking documents, her fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years navigating bureaucratic databases. 23 years ago, she began, her voice taking on the flat, factual tone of someone reading from a police report. There was a fire at Morrison Auto Repair. A devastating fire that started in the electrical system and burned for 6 hours before the fire department could get it under control. Richard felt the blood beginning to drain from his face, though he didn't yet understand why. David Morrison lost everything in that fire, Margaret continued relentlessly. His business, his tools, his customer database, his reputation. His insurance claim was denied due to a technicality about pre-existing electrical problems. He had to declare bankruptcy and lost his family's home to pay the debts. The room started spinning around Richard as fragments of memory began surfacing, his father's voice on phone calls, mentioning problem tenants and legal victories. The building was owned by Sterling Properties, Margaret said, her voice deadly quiet now. Your father's company. The fire was caused by faulty electrical work that Sterling Properties had been ordered to fix on multiple occasions. David Morrison had filed 17 complaints about dangerous wiring, sparking outlets, and circuit breakers that kept failing. Richard's legs gave out, and he stumbled backward onto the plush sofa, his mind reeling with the horrific implications of what he was hearing. Your father's company ignored every single complaint, Margaret continued, her words hitting like individual hammer blows. When the fire finally happened, the fire that every expert said was completely predictable and absolutely preventable, Sterling Properties claimed it was an act of God and refused to take responsibility. Through the cracked bedroom door, Richard could hear Lucy singing along to a Christmas cartoon, her sweet, innocent voice providing a heartbreaking soundtrack to his growing horror. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. David Morrison sued Sterling Properties for negligence. Margaret pressed on, consulting her tablet for the exact details. Your father's legal team buried him in paperwork, filed motion after motion to delay the proceedings, and dragged the case out for 3 years until David Morrison ran out of money to fight. Richard's hands were shaking violently now as the full picture became clear. I didn't know, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I was 15 years old when that happened. I had no idea, my father. Maybe you didn't know then, Margaret agreed, her tone suggesting she might actually believe him. But you know now. And here's the truly remarkable part that makes me wonder if there's such a thing as cosmic justice. She scrolled to another screen, and Richard saw a property record with the Sterling Properties logo prominently displayed. 3 months ago, when Lucy Morrison ran away from her abusive foster placement, guess which abandoned building she chose as her shelter? The old Morrison Auto Repair building on Clark Street. It's been condemned for 15 years, but Sterling Properties, your company now, still owns it. The irony hit Richard like a physical blow. Lucy had been living on property his family owned, in the ruins of the business they had destroyed, surviving on scraps while he lived in luxury, built on the suffering of people like her parents. But wait, there's more, Margaret said with bitter satisfaction. David Morrison spent the next 20 years rebuilding his life from nothing. He worked 3 jobs to support his family while studying nights to become a certified mechanic again. His wife, Sarah, took whatever work she could find to help make ends meet. They never had much money, but they were determined to give their daughter Lucy the childhood they'd lost. From the bedroom, Lucy's voice continued the carol, "Round yon virgin, mother and child, holy infant so tender and mild." The same Christmas song Richard's mother used to sing to him before she died, before his father turned him into the kind of man who could drive families into poverty without losing a moment's sleep. "So here's my question, Mr. Sterling," Margaret said, leaning forward with laser-focused intensity. "Now that you know the truth about how your family destroyed Lucy's family decades before she was even born, now that you understand you've been literally profiting from their suffering for years, what are you going to do about it?" Richard looked up at her with tears streaming down his face, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. "What do you mean? What am I going to do about it?" Margaret leaned back in her chair, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she smiled, not with warmth, but with the satisfaction of someone who had just delivered perfect justice. "I mean, Mr. Sterling, that sometimes the universe gives us a chance to make things right. The question is, are you brave enough to take it? Or are you going to be just another rich man who walks away when confronted with the consequences of his family's actions?" Richard sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours, though the grandfather clock in the corner told him only 10 minutes had passed since Margaret's devastating revelation. The weight of his family's sins pressed down on him like a physical force, making it hard to breathe in the suddenly suffocating luxury of the hotel suite. From the bedroom, Lucy's innocent voice continued singing Christmas carols, completely unaware that her entire tragic story had just taken on dimensions that defied coincidence and entered the realm of cosmic justice. "I need time to process this," Richard finally said, his voice hoarse with emotion. Margaret's expression softened slightly, though her professional vigilance remained intact. "Mr. Sterling, I understand this is overwhelming, but Lucy can't stay here indefinitely. She needs stability, proper care, educational support. She's been through enough trauma without adding more uncertainty to her life. What are my options?" Richard asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. "Legally, very limited." Margaret consulted her tablet again. "You're not a relative. You haven't been approved as a foster parent, and you have no legal standing regarding Lucy's custody. Under normal circumstances, she would be placed in emergency foster care tonight." But these aren't normal circumstances." "No, they're not." Margaret leaned forward, studying Richard's face intently. "The connection between your family and hers changes things, not legally but morally. The question is, what kind of man are you, Richard Sterling? Are you your father's son, or are you something different?" Before Richard could answer, Lucy appeared in the doorway, still wearing his oversized shirt like a dress. Her blonde hair was tousled from lying on the pillows, and she clutched a throw pillow against her chest like a security blanket. "Mr. Richard," she said quietly, "are you okay? You look sad." The simple concern in her voice nearly broke him. Here was this child who had lost everything, who had been failed by every system designed to protect her, and she was worried about his emotional state. "I'm fine, sweetheart," he managed, "just having a grown-up conversation with Miss Margaret." Lucy studied his face with those perceptive blue eyes. "Is she going to make me go away?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Richard looked at Margaret, then back at Lucy, and made a decision that surprised even himself. "No," he said firmly. "She's not." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Sterling, you can't just—" "I want to become Lucy's legal guardian," Richard interrupted, the words coming out with more conviction than he'd felt about anything in years. "Whatever it takes. Background checks, home studies, psychological evaluations, financial assessments. I'll do it all." Lucy's face lit up with hope so bright it was almost painful to look at. "Really? You'd want to be my family?" Richard knelt down to her level, taking her small hands in his much larger ones. "Lucy, I can't replace your mama and daddy. No one could ever do that. But if you'll have me, I'd be honored to take care of you." Margaret was typing rapidly on her tablet. Mr. Sterling, the Guardian application process typically takes 6 to 12 months, involving extensive background checks, financial verification, psychological evaluation, and home studies. During that time, Lucy would need to be placed in temporary foster care. No, Richard said flatly. She's not going back into the system that already failed her. There has to be another way. Margaret looked up from her screen with something calculating in her expression. There might be. It's unusual, but given the unique circumstances and your apparent resources, we could arrange for temporary kinship care pending the completion of your guardian application. What does that mean? It means Lucy could stay with you under supervised conditions while your application is processed. You'd have regular check-ins, supervised visits, and she'd need to start school immediately. Any sign of impropriety or neglect, and she's removed instantly. Richard felt a surge of hope. What do I need to do? Margaret stood up, her professional mask sliding back into place. First, you need to understand that this is not about your guilt over your father's actions, or some desire to play savior. This is about what's best for Lucy. If you're doing this for the wrong reasons, it will end badly for both of you. I understand. Do you? Margaret's voice was sharp. Because in 6 months, when the novelty wears off, when Lucy has nightmares and behavioral issues from her trauma, when she needs expensive therapy and special attention at school, when your business associates start asking uncomfortable questions about why a bachelor has suddenly acquired a child, will you still be committed then? The challenge in her words stung because it touched on Richard's deepest fear. What if he wasn't strong enough for this? What if he let Lucy down the way the system had? But then he looked at Lucy's face, saw the desperate hope in her eyes, and knew he had no choice. "Miss Margaret," Lucy said suddenly, stepping forward with that same fierce courage she'd shown earlier. "Mr. Richard saved my life tonight. He didn't have to stop and help me, but he did. Maybe he feels bad about something his daddy did, but that's not why he wants to help me now." She turned to look at Richard with absolute trust. "He wants to help me because he's got a good heart that he forgot how to use, just like I forgot how to smile until tonight." The wisdom in those words from a 7-year-old left both adults speechless. Margaret closed her tablet with a decisive snap. "I'll need you both at my office tomorrow morning at 9. We have a lot of paperwork to complete and a very long road ahead of us." As she gathered her things to leave, she paused at the door. "Mr. Sterling, you should know that there will be people who question your motives, who assume the worst about a wealthy man suddenly taking interest in a homeless child. Are you prepared for that scrutiny?" Richard thought about his business associates, his social circle, the press that followed his every move. Then he looked at Lucy, still holding his hand with complete faith. "Let them question," he said. "I know what's right." But as Margaret left, and he tucked Lucy into the suite's guest bedroom, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenges were only just beginning. The next morning brought Chicago's first real snowfall of the season, blanketing the city in pristine white that made everything look clean and new. Richard woke to find Lucy pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the hotel suite, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the snow fall in wonder. "I dreamed about Mama and Daddy last night," she said without turning around. They were standing in a field of flowers, and Mama was wearing her yellow dress that made her look like sunshine. Daddy said they were proud of me for being brave. Richard's throat tightened. What else did they say? "They said, you have kind eyes, just like Grandpa Morrison did before he went to heaven. They said I should trust you." Lucy finally turned to face him, her blue eyes serious. "Do you think dead people can really watch over us?" "I think," Richard said carefully, "that love doesn't end just because someone goes away. Your parents will always be part of you, Lucy. Always." They shared breakfast, room service pancakes that Lucy attacked with the enthusiasm of someone still amazed by the concept of unlimited food, before heading to Margaret's office in the Department of Children and Family Services building downtown. The building was a monument to bureaucratic efficiency, all beige walls and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sick. Lucy pressed close to Richard's side as they navigated endless corridors filled with the sound of crying children and exhausted caseworkers. Margaret's office was a cluttered sanctuary of case files, family photos, and inspirational posters that had seen better days. She gestured for them to sit in uncomfortable plastic chairs across from her metal desk. "I've been reviewing your preliminary background check, Mr. Sterling," she began without preamble. "On paper, you're an ideal guardian candidate. Substantial financial resources, stable housing, no criminal record, excellent health. But I have concerns, such as you've never been married, never had children, and according to your social media presence, you've never been in a relationship that lasted longer than 6 months. You work 70-hour weeks and travel frequently for business. Your lifestyle is fundamentally incompatible with raising a traumatized child." Each point hit like a physical blow because they were all true. Richard had structured his entire adult life around avoiding exactly this kind of responsibility and emotional commitment. "People change," he said quietly. "Do they?" Margaret pulled out a thick folder. "Because I also have reports here about your business practices. Evictions filed against families during holidays. Rent increases that forced elderly tenants out of their homes. You've built your fortune by treating people like numbers on a spreadsheet." Lucy's hand slipped into Richard's, her fingers intertwining with his, in a gesture of support that made his chest tight with emotion. "Miss Margaret," Lucy said in her clear, brave voice, "my daddy always said you can't judge a tree by its bark. You got to look at what kind of fruit it grows. Maybe Mr. Richard grew bad fruit before, but he's trying to grow good fruit now." Margaret's stern expression softened slightly. "That's very wise, Lucy. But good intentions aren't enough when it comes to a child's welfare." "What do I need to prove to you that I'm serious about this?" Richard asked. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying him intently. "Actions, Mr. Sterling. Not words, not promises, not good intentions. Actions." She pulled out a legal document. "I'm approving temporary kinship care for 30 days. During that time, Lucy will live with you under the following conditions. She starts school immediately at Lincoln Elementary. She begins counseling with a child trauma specialist. You attend parenting classes twice a week. I conduct unannounced home visits. And—" Margaret paused dramatically. "You personally oversee the renovation of the Morrison Auto Repair Building into a community center that provides services for homeless families and children, at your own expense. Not Sterling Properties' expense, your personal expense." The condition hit Richard like a slap. She was asking him to spend millions of his own money to atone for his father's sins. "That building is worth at least $5 million in potential development," he said. "And how much is Lucy's future worth?" Margaret countered. "How much is your soul worth, Mr. Sterling?" Richard looked at Lucy, who was watching this exchange with rapt attention, then back at Margaret. "When do I start?" Margaret smiled for the first time since he'd met her. "Today." Indeed, 2 weeks into their new arrangement, Richard discovered that raising a traumatized 7-year-old was infinitely more challenging than running a multi-million-dollar corporation. Lucy's nightmares came every few nights, sending her running to his bedroom at 2 a.m, sobbing about dreams where cars crashed and people disappeared forever. "I can't find them," she would whisper, clinging to him with desperate strength. "I keep looking and looking, but they're not there anymore." Richard would hold her until the trembling stopped, humming half-remembered lullabies his mother had sung to him decades ago. These midnight vigils left him exhausted, but he discovered something remarkable. For the first time in his adult life, Someone needed him for something more important than money. The transition to school had been brutal. Lucy was academically advanced, but socially withdrawn, sitting alone at lunch and flinching whenever other children approached too quickly. Mrs. Henderson called with daily reports that made Richard's heart ache. "She's brilliant, but she's also hyper-vigilant," the teacher explained during one of their frequent phone conferences. "She sits where she can see all the exits, won't use the bathroom without permission, and hoards snacks in her desk like she's afraid the food will run out." Dr. Emily Rodriguez, the child trauma specialist Margaret had mandated, was more direct. "Lucy has classic symptoms of complex PTSD. The loss of her parents, months of homelessness and abuse in foster care have created deep psychological wounds. Healing will take years, not weeks." "What can I do?" Richard asked during their second session. "Consistency, patience, and unconditional positive regard," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "Lucy needs to learn that she's safe, that you're not going anywhere, and that she deserves love regardless of her behavior." That last part proved prophetic when Lucy's trauma manifested in unexpected ways. She broke a priceless vase during a particularly bad flashback, threw a screaming fit in the grocery store when they ran out of her favorite cereal, and once tried to run away because she was convinced Richard was getting tired of her. "Everyone gets tired of me eventually," she sobbed when he found her hiding in the hotel's service elevator. "That's why nobody wants to keep me." "Lucy Elizabeth Morrison," Richard said firmly, kneeling to her level, "I am never going to get tired of you. Never. Do you understand me? Promise?" "I promise." But keeping that promise was tested when his business associates began asking uncomfortable questions about his sudden unavailability. His social circle had begun to distance themselves, confused by his transformation from ruthless developer to devoted guardian. The worst came during a business dinner he couldn't avoid, when Robert Carlson, his longtime partner, pulled him aside. "Richard, people are talking. The press is starting to ask questions about why you suddenly have a kid. Some of them are implying unsavory things." "Let them imply whatever they want," Richard replied coldly. "This is damaging your reputation, our reputation. Maybe you should reconsider this whole guardian thing before it destroys everything you've built." Richard looked across the restaurant at Lucy, who was sitting with the hostess, charming her with stories about her new school. Even in her simple department store dress, she was radiant with the kind of joy that money couldn't buy. "Robert, if caring for a child destroys my reputation, then I never had a reputation worth keeping." The conversation was overheard by Harold Blackstone, the most vindictive gossip in Chicago's social elite. Within 48 hours, rumors were swirling through the city's business community like wildfire. Richard Sterling had taken in a homeless girl under mysterious circumstances. Some said it was a publicity stunt. Others whispered darker theories about wealthy men and vulnerable children. The Chicago Tribune's Society columnist ran a thinly veiled piece, questioning the appropriateness of Sterling's sudden interest in child welfare. The story went national when a blogger picked it up and added salacious speculation about Sterling's motives. By the end of the week, Richard's phone was ringing non-stop with interview requests from journalists who smelled scandal. "Daddy Richard," Lucy said one evening, using the name she'd recently started calling him. "Why are those people saying mean things about you on TV?" Richard turned off the news broadcast, cursing himself for letting her see it. Some people don't understand why someone would want to help a child without expecting something in return. "But you're not expecting anything in return," Lucy said with the absolute certainty of childhood. "You just love me." And the simple truth of her words hit him like a revelation. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks, without realizing it, he had fallen completely in love with this brave, brilliant, damaged little girl. Yes, he said quietly. "I just love you." But that love was about to be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. The Cook County family court building loomed over Richard like a concrete monument to judgment, its brutalist architecture designed to intimidate rather than inspire confidence. As he walked up the steps with Margaret Thornfield, Richard felt like a man walking to his own execution. "Remember," Margaret said quietly, "stay calm, answer only what's asked, and don't let Carlson's attorney provoke you. Judge Martinez is fair but tough. She doesn't tolerate games." Lucy was in school, blissfully unaware that her entire future was being decided in a sterile courtroom downtown. Richard had kissed her forehead that morning and promised to pick her up after classes, a promise that might turn out to be the last lie he ever told her. Robert Carlson sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, Victoria Cross, a sharp-dressed woman with the predatory smile of someone who specialized in destroying families. Carlson wouldn't meet Richard's eyes, which told him everything he needed to know about his former friend's conscience. Judge Maria Martinez was a stern woman in her 60s, whose reputation for cutting through nonsense was legendary in Chicago legal circles. She reviewed the case file with practiced efficiency before calling the hearing to order. "This is an emergency custody review regarding Lucy Morrison, currently in temporary kinship care with Richard Sterling," she began. "Mr. Carlson, your attorney may present your case." Victoria Cross rose with theatrical flair, her expensive heels clicking against the marble floor. "Your Honor, we're here today because a vulnerable child is in imminent danger. Mr. Sterling has exhibited erratic behavior, made impulsive decisions that threaten his business empire, and is clearly suffering from some form of mental breakdown." She gestured to a stack of documents. "In the past 2 weeks, he has cancelled millions of dollars in business deals, abruptly changed his entire lifestyle, and isolated himself from friends and colleagues who've known him for decades. This is not the behavior of a stable guardian." De Cross called Carlson to the stand, and Richard watched his former friend prepare to destroy him with surgical precision. "Robert, how long have you known the defendant?" 15 years. We built Sterling Properties together from nothing." "And how would you describe his character during that time?" Carlson finally looked at Richard, his expression a mixture of regret and resolve. "Ruthless, brilliant in business, but completely self-centered. Richard has never shown interest in children, never dated anyone seriously, never expressed desire for a family. This sudden attachment to Lucy Morrison is completely out of character. In your professional opinion, is Richard Sterling capable of providing stable care for a traumatized child?" "No," Carlson said firmly. "I believe he's having some kind of breakdown, and Lucy is paying the price for his instability." When it was Margaret's turn to cross-examine, she rose slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Mr. Carlson, you mentioned that Mr. Sterling has become less focused on business. Can you be more specific?" "He's been unavailable for important meetings, cancelled major deals, and seems more interested in playing house with Lucy than running our company. So he's been prioritizing a child's welfare over profit margins?" "Yes, but, and this concerns you, why exactly?" Carlson's face flushed. "Because it's not sustainable, because it's not who he is." Margaret smiled coldly. "Mr. Carlson, how much money would Sterling Properties lose if Mr. Sterling continued this erratic behavior?" "Potentially millions. And as his business partner, you would lose money too, wouldn't you?" "Yes, but that's not why I'm here." "Isn't it?" Margaret's voice was like ice. "Isn't it true that you filed this petition because Richard's newfound conscience is bad for business?" Oh, when Margaret called Richard to testify, he stood on shaking legs, knowing that Lucy's entire future depended on what he said in the next few minutes. "Mr. Sterling," Margaret began gently, "why do you want to be Lucy's guardian?" Richard looked out at the courtroom, saw Carlson's guilty face, Cross's predatory smile, and Judge Martinez's impassive expression. Then he thought about Lucy's laughter, her midnight tears, the way she'd learned to trust him despite everything she'd been through. "Because she's my daughter," he said simply. "Not biologically, but in every way that matters. She's changed me, shown me what it means to love someone more than yourself. I can't give her back her parents, but I can give her a future." Cross's cross-examination was brutal, focusing on every mistake he'd ever made, every ruthless business decision, every relationship he'd failed to maintain. But Richard answered each question honestly, acknowledging his past while defending his present. Judge Martinez called a recess to review the evidence. When court reconvened, her expression was unreadable. "This case presents an unusual situation," she began. "However, after reviewing all testimony and evidence, I find that Lucy Morrison's current placement serves her best interests. Mr. Carlson's petition is denied." Relief flooded through Richard like a tidal wave, but Judge Martinez wasn't finished. "Mr. Sterling, understand that this decision is provisional. Any evidence of instability or harm to Lucy will result in immediate removal. You are walking a tightrope, and I will be watching." As they left the courthouse, Richard felt victorious, but wary. The real battle, he sensed, was just beginning. The victory in court should have been a celebration, but Richard quickly discovered that winning the legal battle was only the beginning of his war for Lucy's future. The media attention that had been simmering for weeks exploded into a full-scale feeding frenzy, with photographers camping outside Lucy's school and reporters shoving microphones in Richard's face every time he left his building. "Mr. Sterling, is it true you're paying the Morrison family's medical bills?" "Richard, what's your response to allegations of improper conduct? How much are you spending to buy your way out of guilt?" The questions followed him everywhere, a relentless chorus of suspicion and accusation that made simple activities like grocery shopping or taking Lucy to the park feel like running a gauntlet. Lucy herself began to withdraw again, overwhelmed by the sudden attention and confused by the adults shouting questions she didn't understand. "Daddy Richard," she asked one evening as they watched the news coverage from their hotel suite, "why do those people think you're a bad man? Don't they know you saved me?" "Some people have forgotten how to believe in good things," he said, turning off the television, "but that doesn't make the good things less real." The pressure was taking its toll on both of them. Lucy's nightmares returned with renewed intensity, and Richard found himself making mistakes at work that he would never have made before. His concentration was shot, his confidence shaken by the constant scrutiny of people determined to find fault with his every move. Dr. Rodriguez noticed the regression immediately during Lucy's therapy session. "She's hyper-vigilant again," the therapist told Richard privately. "All the progress we made is being undone by this media circus. You need to find a way to give her stability and privacy, or she's going to suffer permanent damage." That same day, Margaret Thornfield called with news that made Richard's stomach drop. "Richard, I've received another complaint, this time from the Chicago Board of Education. Someone reported that Lucy's attendance has been sporadic and that she's been seen in public during school hours." "That's because reporters were harassing her at school," Richard protested. "I had to pull her out early 3 times this week to protect her from photographers." "I understand, but the board is questioning whether you're providing appropriate educational stability. They're threatening to recommend she be removed from your care." That evening, as he tucked Lucy into bed, she grabbed his hand with unusual urgency. "Daddy Richard, are they going to take me away, too?" The direct question hit him like a physical blow. "Why would you ask that, sweetheart? I heard you talking on the phone, and Mrs. Henderson at school said some people think you're not my real daddy." Tears began streaming down her cheeks. I don't want to go back to the bad place. Please don't let them take me." Richard gathered her into his arms, his own eyes burning with tears he refused to shed. "Lucy, I promise you, I will never let anyone take you away from me. Never." "But what if you can't stop them? What if they're stronger than you?" "Then we'll run away," Richard said, surprising himself with the fierce conviction in his voice. "We'll go somewhere they can't find us, and we'll be a family anyway." As she finally drifted off to sleep, Richard made a decision that would have shocked everyone who thought they knew him. He called his attorney and began making arrangements to liquidate his assets. If the world was determined to take Lucy from him through legal channels, he would remove himself from their jurisdiction entirely. But the next morning brought news that changed everything. Margaret Thornfield arrived at their hotel suite at 7 a.m., carrying a folder thick with official documents and wearing an expression Richard had never seen before, something that looked almost like awe. "Richard," she said without preamble, "sit down. You need to hear this. I received a call last night from David Morrison's former attorney," she began, "the one who handled his lawsuit against your father 23 years ago." Richard's blood chilled. What did he want? "To give me information that changes everything." Margaret opened the folder and pulled out a yellowed legal document. "Richard, your father didn't just ignore the electrical problems at Morrison Auto Repair. He knew about them weeks before the fire. He had reports from his own inspectors warning that the building was a death trap." "I don't understand." "Your father deliberately chose not to fix the problems because he wanted David Morrison to fail. He wanted to bankrupt him so he could buy the property for a fraction of its value and redevelop it." The revelation hit Richard like a sledgehammer. "You're saying my father caused that fire intentionally?" "Not directly, but he created the conditions knowing exactly what would happen. It wasn't neglect, Richard. It was calculated destruction." Margaret pulled out another document, a handwritten letter bearing his father's letterhead. "This is a memo your father wrote to his insurance company 3 days before the fire. He describes David Morrison as a bleeding heart who needs to learn his place and predicts that financial pressure will force him to accept reality." Richard stared at his father's handwriting, his hands trembling as the full scope of the evil became clear. He destroyed that family on purpose. "But here's what you need to understand," Margaret continued. "David Morrison never gave up. He spent 20 years gathering evidence, building a case, trying to prove what your father had done. He died still fighting for justice." She pulled out the final document, David Morrison's will. "Richard, David Morrison left everything he'd discovered to Lucy. Every document, every piece of evidence, every legal strategy. He made his attorney promise that if anything happened to him and Sarah, Lucy would inherit not just his love, but his fight for justice." Richard looked up from the papers, his vision blurred with tears. "What are you telling me?" Margaret smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, it was a smile of pure joy. "I'm telling you that Lucy Morrison isn't just an orphan you rescued from the streets. She's the legal heir to the most comprehensive case of corporate malfeasance in Chicago history. Her father spent 2 decades building a lawsuit that could destroy sterling properties and everything your family built." The room spun around Richard as the implications became clear. "She could ruin me." "She could," Margaret agreed, "or you could help her get the justice her father died trying to achieve. The choice is yours, Richard Sterling. Will you be your father's son, or will you be the man Lucy believes you are?" As if summoned by their conversation, Lucy appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes, wearing one of Richard's T-shirts like a nightgown. "Daddy, Richard, why are you crying? Did someone die?" Richard looked at this brave little girl who held his entire future in her innocent hands and realized that some choices weren't choices at all. They were simply opportunities to become the person you were always meant to be. Richard Sterling stood in his penthouse office 1 year later, watching the morning sun paint Chicago's skyline in shades of gold and amber. The view from the 42nd floor was the same, but everything else had changed in ways he never could have imagined. On his desk lay the final legal documents that would transfer ownership of Sterling Properties to the David Morrison Memorial Foundation, a charity he and Lucy had established to provide housing and support for homeless families. His empire, worth over $200 million, would become Lucy's legacy to her father's memory. Daddy Richard. Lucy appeared in the doorway, her blonde hair now neatly braided and her school uniform pristine. At 8 years old, she had grown into a confident, radiant child whose smile could still stop his heart. "Are you ready? We don't want to be late for the ceremony." Richard smiled at the little girl who had saved his soul by letting him save hers. "Almost ready, sweetheart. Just finishing up some paperwork. The boring grown-up kind that makes you sigh a lot. The important kind that makes everything right." That morning, a year ago, when Margaret had revealed Lucy's inheritance, Richard had faced the most crucial decision of his life. He could have fought it, used his lawyers to tie up David Morrison's evidence in legal battles for decades. He could have protected his fortune and his father's reputation. Instead, he had done something that shocked everyone who knew him. He had helped Lucy file the lawsuit against his own company. The legal battle had been brutal and public. Every newspaper in America covered the David Morrison case, the story of a mechanic whose family was destroyed by corporate greed, and the millionaire who chose justice over fortune. Richard had testified against his own father's actions, providing additional evidence that ensured Sterling Properties' complete defeat. The settlement had been the largest in Chicago's legal history, $75 million in damages, plus the transfer of 17 properties to the Morrison Foundation. Richard had personally added another $50 million of his own money to ensure the foundation could operate in perpetuity. "Mr. Sterling," his assistant James had said when Richard announced the decision, "you realize this will destroy everything you've built?" "No, James," Richard had replied, watching Lucy practice her violin in the corner of his office. "This will build everything that matters." The media had called it everything from corporate suicide to the greatest act of redemption in business history. Richard called it the first day of his real life. Now, as they rode the elevator down to the lobby, Lucy took his hand with the unconscious trust that still amazed him daily. "Daddy Richard, are you sad about giving away all your money?" It was a question she'd asked several times over the past year, always with the worried expression of a child who feared she was the cause of his sacrifice. "Lucy, let me tell you something important," Richard said, kneeling to her eye level as the elevator descended. "The day I found you in that alley, I was the poorest man in Chicago. I had everything money could buy and nothing that money couldn't. But the moment you trusted me enough to take my hand, I became the richest man alive. Because you had someone to love? Because I had someone to love who loved me back." That's what your daddy meant when he said being rich wasn't about money. He was teaching you the most valuable lesson in the world. The elevator opened into the hotel lobby, where Margaret Thornfield waited with a proud smile. Over the past year, she had become not just Lucy's caseworker, but their friend, watching with amazement as both Richard and Lucy healed from their different traumas. "Ready for the big day?" Margaret asked. "More than ready," Richard replied. They drove through Chicago's streets to the south side, where the old Morrison Auto Repair building had been transformed into something beautiful. What had once been a condemned reminder of corporate cruelty was now the David and Sarah Morrison Community Center, a gleaming facility that provided temporary housing, job training, childcare, and educational support for families in crisis. Hundreds of people had gathered for the dedication ceremony. Families who had been helped by the foundation, city officials, reporters, and even some of Richard's former business associates who had come to witness his remarkable transformation. Lucy stepped up to the microphone with the poise of someone far older than her 8 years. She had insisted on giving the dedication speech herself, despite Richard's offers to help. "My name is Lucy Morrison," she began, her clear voice carrying across the crowd. "A year ago, I was living in an alley behind this building, eating garbage and freezing in the cold. I thought I was going to die and nobody would care." Richard felt tears stinging his eyes as he watched this incredible child speak with such courage and grace. "But then a man found me and saved my life. He didn't have to stop. He could have walked away like everyone else did. But he saw me, and he cared, and he decided that loving someone was more important than protecting himself." She turned to look at Richard, her blue eyes shining with unshed tears. "My daddy always said that we're not here to see through each other, but to see each other through. That's what families do. They see each other through the hard times and celebrate together in the good times." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. "This building is named for my mama and daddy, but it exists because of all of you. Because when good people decide to help instead of looking away, miracles happen. My family is proof that love is stronger than money, that kindness is more powerful than cruelty, and that sometimes the people who save us are the ones who need saving most." She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Daddy Richard gave up everything to make sure other families wouldn't go through what mine did. He chose love over money, and that choice changed both our lives forever. So this center isn't just about helping families. It's about remembering that we're all family, and family never gives up on each other. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Richard barely heard it. He was too focused on Lucy as she ran into his arms, this miraculous child who had taught him that the only fortune worth having was the one you shared with others. Later that evening, as they sat in their new apartment, a modest 3-bedroom place in Lucy's school district, she curled up next to him on the couch. "Daddy Richard, do you ever miss being super rich?" Richard looked around their simple home, filled with Lucy's artwork and school projects, family photos from their first year together, and the comfortable clutter of a real family's life. Through the window, he could see the Morrison Community Center's lights still on, helping another family find hope in their darkest hour. "Lucy, I've never been richer in my life." She smiled and snuggled closer. "Me either. Mama and Daddy would be so proud of us." "They are proud of us, sweetheart. Wherever they are, they're proud." As Lucy drifted off to sleep against his shoulder, Richard Sterling reflected on the extraordinary year that had transformed them both. He had lost a fortune, but gained a family. He had given up an empire, but inherited something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that love multiplied when shared, that redemption was always possible, and that sometimes the greatest Christmas miracle was simply learning how to open your heart. Outside their window, snow began to fall on Chicago, just as it had that Christmas Eve when a millionaire's frozen heart met a homeless child's desperate hope. But this time, neither of them was alone. They were home, they were family, and they were living proof that love, indeed, was the only fortune that truly mattered. In the end, Richard Sterling had learned the most important lesson of all, that the richest people in the world aren't those who have the most, but those who love the most. And by that measure, he and Lucy Morrison Sterling were the wealthiest family in America.